U.S. foreign policy must contend with growing threats at a time when the American public is exhausted by adventures abroad and divided over what American leadership in the 21st century should be. To walk us through our complex and dangerous world is National Security Advisor Susan Rice, who has been part of the Obama administration in some capacity since the president's first term. She's joined here in conversation with Wall Street Journal, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief Jerry Seib. Susan Rice, Jerry Seib.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming. I was struck thinking about preparing these questions for you that there's hardly anything going on in the world. You must have spare time on your hands constantly, so we'll try to steer past that to a couple of things that are happening right now. Let me start with Syria and with the Islamic State. And I'm going to ask you a question you may not have ever been asked about this subject before, which is, what happens if we win? What happens if we defeat Islamic State? And I ask you this because you've put together a nice coalition to combat Islamic State, but the only thing they probably agree on is that Islamic State or ISIL ought to be defeated, because when it comes to what should happen in Syria, what should happen to President Assad, what should happen in Iraq, what should happen to the Kurds, they don't agree on much of anything. How do you hold this coalition together? If you're successful, what happens then?
Well, Jerry, first of all, thank you for doing this, and I look forward to the conversation, and thank you all for being here. If and when, because I do believe we will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL with our coalition of over 60 countries, let's think about what that end state looks like. First of all, it means that ISIL, which currently poses a serious threat to not only Iraq and Syria and the neighboring countries, but potentially to the United States and Europe, will no longer have a functional safe haven in that critical region. It will no longer be in a position to terrorize and destabilize both those countries, but the neighboring countries as well. Denying ISIL a safe haven is a critical strategic objective, because as we've seen from such safe havens to which foreign fighters and others are attracted, they can export terrorism and other forms of violence. So that in itself is a critical objective. That will not, in and of itself, resolve the problem of Syria. It will substantially create breathing space for the new Iraqi government and the leadership there to stabilize and unify that country, which is facing its own sectarian and economic and other challenges. So it takes a critical impediment off the table for Iraq, but it does, as you acknowledge, leave a challenge in Syria. Remember, the conflict in Syria began over 3 years ago when peaceful protesters challenged the Assad regime, and the Assad regime responded with overwhelming and indiscriminate violence, which it has sustained. The political issues that remain at the heart of the Syrian conflict will endure. The majority Sunni population has largely been excluded from power. There is no democratic process. You have an illegitimate and exceedingly violent leadership that has created conditions not only that have been so harmful to the population, but have made it a very attractive magnet for terrorists. The magnet having been eliminated, we will still need to see a political solution in Syria, and that's been our view all along, that there's ultimately not a military solution to the conflict.
Does that solution still require that President Assad go?
It will ultimately have to result in Assad's departure, because given the violence that he's perpetrated and given the divisions that are now, I believe, unbridgeable ultimately, you may have a transition period of some sort, but Assad's departure is going to be critical for there to be lasting stability in Syria. And that's one of the main reasons, Jerry, that we have supported the moderate Syrian opposition and why we are trying to substantially ramp up that support, not only to counter ISIL, but also to create an environment ultimately in which it's more likely that there is a negotiated settlement.
But as you know, there's been some confusion in the last 48 hours about whether we're arming the Free Syrian Army, the moderate opposition, to fight the Islamic State or to fight President Assad. Are they doing both, or are they supposed to do one or the other?
They're having to do both as we speak. They are fighting a multi-front conflict, which is obviously taking a real toll on them. So our support for the moderate opposition is, in the first instance, going to enable them to fend off ISIL, but it is also designed and originated with the concept of trying to help create conditions on the ground that are conducive to negotiations, and that means helping them in their conflict against Assad as well.
Let's step back from this a little bit and look at the region. Syria's borders arguably don't really exist anymore. Iraq is somewhere between 1 and 3 states, some people think. Jordan is imperiled by Islamic State. Lebanon could conceivably be threatened. What does this region look like in 10 years? Which states survive? How does it get put back together again?
I think the nation states survive. I think, again, in the context of a successful outcome vis-a-vis ISIL, the border between Iraq and Syria, which is really the one that has become more blurred, will be fully reestablished. Obviously, Israel's borders will be very fully and well defended, remain sacrosanct, and our commitment to that is unshakable. But what's happening, Lebanon has long had its share of internal challenges. I don't suspect that they will go away as a result of ISIL being defeated. But Jordan is one of the countries that has been most challenged by the overflow
right.
of refugees and the spillover
maybe even
of the
transformed
conflict.
Ultimately by that.
And we have invested very heavily in supporting the Jordanian government, helping to build its capacity, helping it deal with the refugee outflow. And so I think Jordan will be a place where our support and that of others in the region and beyond will be critical to shore up a country that has suffered the brunt of much of what's transpired in Syria.
Let me move a little further west in the region and ask you about Israel. Our mutual friend Jeffrey Goldberg wrote a piece this week saying that U.S.-Israeli relations are in a state of crisis. I guess the twofold question is, are they? And are they strong enough, even if they're not in crisis, to withstand some tough decisions that lie ahead about the Iranian nuclear program?
The relationship is not in crisis. The relationship is actually fundamentally stronger in many respects than it's ever been. We have the greatest and strongest security cooperation between the United States and Israel that has ever occurred, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has heralded that on many occasions. President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu have a constructive and effective relationship. They have met one another more frequently than President Obama has met any other foreign leader. He was just in the Oval Office earlier this month for extensive consultations. Tonight, I am taking my Israeli counterpart, the National Security Advisor, to dinner on the eve of what we do 2 times a year, which is I will host tomorrow a large Israeli delegation for something called the Israeli Consultative Group, where they bring equivalents from their intelligence community, their defense establishment, their diplomatic establishment. They meet with our colleagues and counterparts at very senior levels in all of those agencies, and we share information and engage in strategy on the range of issues that are of mutual interest in the region, from Iran to the ISIL and all of the issues that we're discussing here today and many others. That kind of deep cooperation, consultation, sharing, strategizing is unprecedented, and that's something that has evolved uniquely in this administration. So there are issues we disagree on. The most prominent one that you have seen manifested itself, unfortunately, in the press has been on the issue of settlements, right, where for decades the United States has had a different view of settlements and their legitimacy than the Israeli government has. The U.S. view has long been, under multiple administrations, that settlement activity is illegitimate and it's counterproductive to the goal of a 2-state solution. Obviously, this Israeli government has taken a different view, and when such announcements are made that are significant in their consequence, we're compelled to comment on them. But that's not a reflection of the health of the larger bilateral relationship, which is quite strong.
Interestingly, at the same time, there seem to be a lot more areas of common ground between the U.S. and Iran emerging, not the least of which is ISIL, obviously, but perhaps even a stable Iraq, perhaps some other areas where there have been disagreements in the past. Is this a kind of a detente emerging with the Iranians? And does that lead to a successful outcome of the conversations with them, the negotiations over the nuclear program?
I saw such a story on the front page
Perhaps
of
you
your
did.
esteemed newspaper this morning. That is
Slow.
not a term I would
I didn't ask you to use it.
or even consider using. Détente? No.
Okay,
not at all.
use your term.
No, frankly, we still have a very difficult and fraught relationship with Iran for all the obvious reasons. They have a record of supporting terrorism. They have a record of destabilizing the neighboring states and countries in the region. And we're very, very concerned also about their effort to obtain a nuclear weapon. What is true is that over the course of the last year, we have been able to reach and implement an interim agreement that has halted all progress in the Iranian nuclear program and rolled it back in some critical respects. This joint agreement has created a more stable foundation for negotiations aimed at trying to reach a comprehensive agreement to eliminate any risk that Iran can develop a nuclear weapon. Those negotiations, as you know, and maybe others do too, are coming to an important milestone in November, when by the 24th of November, we have the period of negotiations expiring. So there is no détente, there is frankly no dramatic change in the nature of the relationship. If we were to achieve an agreement on the nuclear program, that would be a very significant accomplishment, which would make Americans more secure and the region more secure, but it wouldn't end our concerns about other aspects of their behavior.
Odds of success on that?
It's hard to judge. I would say, 50% or less.
Shifting to Russia and Ukraine, because I wanted to touch on that and Ebola before our time runs out. President Putin gave a remarkable address late last week, which makes for fascinating reading, at an international conference, in which he said that the U.S. declared itself the winner of the Cold War, tried to impose a universal diktat on the globe. It has supported since then neo-fascists and Islamic radicals, has used economic and propaganda pressure to meddle in other nations' domestic affairs, has resorted to outright blackmail against a number of world leaders, has supported a coup d'etat in Ukraine, and is spending billions of dollars to keep the whole world under surveillance. How's that relationship going? Yeah, and more seriously, can you work with him?
That sounds like a classic Soviet diatribe. The relationship with Russia is obviously very strained by its actions to illegally annex Crimea and its infiltration into the rest of Ukraine. The relationship is also under great strain because the United States has successfully rallied the major economies to impose now very biting sanctions on the Russian economy to extract a very high price for their behavior. Now, they have withdrawn the bulk, but not all of their forces from Ukraine, and there is a very fragile Minsk agreement and sometimes ceasefire, which is thankfully created space so that the Ukrainians could have a successful election for their parliament last Sunday, and we hope will enable President Poroshenko to have the kind of governing coalition that will enable him to enact critical reforms and move, as he has chosen to, towards Europe. But the relationship with Russia is strained, and there remain areas where we have been able to continue working together in a constructive vein. The Iran negotiations are one example of that. And I could give you others, but there are a wider range of areas where the relationship is more difficult.
I did want to ask about Ebola before we run out of time. You're heading off for some conversations with the president and others about that this afternoon, as I understand it. What have you learned about the world's ability to cope with a problem like this since the outbreak of the Ebola crisis, if that's not too strong a word?
Well, Jerry, I think, first of all, it's important to understand that what we have all learned as a consequence of Ebola is something that we understood quite a while ago, which is that the global health infrastructure is exceedingly fragile. We saw that following SARS. We've seen that with H1N1, with MERS, which is the strange virus that has evolved out of the Gulf region. And recognizing that, as a result, back in February of this year, President Obama launched something called the Global Health Security Agenda, bringing 40 countries together from around the world to commit to help the more fragile developing countries build their national health infrastructures. And what we've learned in part from the Ebola experience, which frankly, Ebola is a far less transmissible disease than the ones that I just described, can't be transmitted in an airborne fashion. You have to be symptomatic and exchange bodily fluids. And yet, it's obviously caused a great deal of loss of life in West Africa and fear and effects in this country and beyond. We have a national security imperative to build the capacity of countries around the world, whether in West Africa or Southeast Asia or parts of Central Asia for that matter, such that they have the healthcare infrastructure to detect and monitor and contain disease. Because we are only as secure, when I say we, I mean the United States, countries of the world, as the weakest link in the fabric here, in the chain. So, and this is the illustration that we've seen with Ebola. We are living in an interconnected global economy and global system. We have no direct flights to the United States at the present from those three countries in West Africa, and yet we are linked up with them. Some 60 to 70% of the people who travel to the United States from those three countries are in fact American citizens or green card holders. Right. So we are linked up in a very significant way. And that's true of our relationships with countries around the world. It's not, frankly, unique to those three countries in West Africa. So given that, it is critical that over the long term we take from this experience, which we will manage to bring under control with the help of the rest of the international community, the lesson that we have to build for the future. The President had that vision well in advance of the Ebola crisis. We have started this global health security agenda. It is gaining traction and the support of critical partners around the world, but we've got to stay committed to this over the long term.
But is that happening? Is there,
yes.
Is there emerging from this some idea of an infrastructure that can prevent
yes.
round two?
And but it's going to take time, because obviously building health infrastructure is not something that happens overnight. But we had, at the end of September here in Washington, a major gathering at the ministerial level of the representatives of these 40 countries, and each of them made commitments to strengthen the healthcare infrastructure and a number of other developing nations. And the United States has taken on its share, other countries are doing their part, and that's going to have to be a set of investments that we sustain over time and take very seriously.
Let me ask you this final question. You know, there's the list of problem areas is long. I didn't even get through them all here. But I want, and by the way, the Attorney General got to answer as a final question, who should play him in the movie? You should feel free to answer that question if you would like.
Halle Berry.
Okay, there you go. Consensus choice, clearly.
I should be so lucky.
The more serious final question I was going to ask you was this. You know, I wonder, for somebody in your position, when you go home at night, what's the thing you would like to be able to spend your time on that you can't? In other words,
kids.
Okay, that's true. I'm sure that's true. What's the world problem you'd like to be able to devote some brain cells to?
Well,
because things get pushed off the radar screen by the crisis of the moment, and most people have in the back of their mind something they wish they could get around to. And I just wonder if there's one of those for you.
Well, in fact, Jerry, I mean, it may be hard to imagine if you're watching the television and seeing what is being relayed every day. But the fact of the matter is, we have no choice but to be working not only on the hot issues or even the crises of the day, but the long-term aspects of our agenda. And what we were just discussing, the Global Health Security Agenda, is a classic example of something that gets very little attention or press. Most people wouldn't know about it if it weren't for the Ebola crisis, and even though there is an Ebola crisis, most people don't know about it. But it is building architecture for the long term. And we are doing that in many different respects, whether it's our non-proliferation agenda and the nuclear security summits that we've held to lock down and try to make much safer nuclear materials that are in various disparate places around the world, whether it's our efforts to strengthen the capacity of fragile states more broadly, build open government partnerships, another important initiative of the administration where we're trying to fight corruption and build transparency in countries around the world. And I'll give you an interesting example of why that matters. This open government partnership, which now has brought together 60 countries to make commitments that they will share information with their populations. You can see, where tax revenue goes and have all kinds of systems that hold governments accountable. It's very valuable in general for democracy, for voters to be able to know what's going on. But we have, one of our open government partners is actually Sierra Leone. And because Sierra Leone is part of this system, they have been able to utilize and disseminate information with their population that has been beneficial in communicating and dealing with the Ebola epidemic. So all of these things are interrelated. And even though they may not be front page of the Wall Street Journal, they are important, lasting contributions that the president is committed to locking down that will, in fact, leave behind a far more secure and far more open and democratic set of partners around the world.
Well, Susan Rice, I do hope in the midst of all that you do get more time with your kids. And thank you for taking time today.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it very much.